right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the VulnWise Show, where we bring you interviews with top cybersecurity experts and thought leaders to help you conquer the chaos of vulnerability and exposure management. I'm Steve Carter. I'm the CEO and a co-founder at Nucleus Security. I'm joined by my friend and fellow co-founder, Scott Kuffer. And today we're going to talk about CTEM, or Continuous Threat and Exposure Management, with our guest, Chris Peltz from GuidePoint Security, who led the exposure management practice at GuidePoint for, I think, 4 or 5 years. And as of last week, leads the security strategy and architecture team. So Chris, first off, big congratulations on your new role at GuidePoint, and thanks for being here today.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Always excited to talk about exposure management.
All right. Well, I was really excited that you agreed to come on today because CTEM is a topic that continues to come up more and more at Nucleus, and you're one of probably the most knowledgeable and experienced practitioners I know when it comes to this topic. If anyone better to sit down with for a deep dive here, but I like to start kind of with the basics at the most foundational level. How do you differentiate between a vulnerability and an exposure?
Sure. A vulnerability is a specific weakness in our technology. An exposure matches a weakness with a corresponding threat. Effectively, a vulnerability can be theoretical, and exposure is verified as exploitable in our environment.
Gotcha. So it sounds like, when I think of exposure management, exposures in general, you mentioned there that vulnerabilities are theoretical. I kind of think of it a little bit differently. I was thinking almost like vulnerabilities kind of focus on known things that are known to be vulnerable, like known CVEs and things like that, where exposures are more broad than that and seem almost more proactive, or if you're thinking in terms of exposure management, more proactive than vulnerability management. Is that wrong, or is that just kind of a different way of thinking about it?
You touch on a really good point there, that an exposure can encompass more than one vulnerability. So you can have multiple CVEs, you could even have misconfigurations contributing to one exposure, which is one exploitable problem. But in terms of really what Gartner's getting at when they're using the term exposure in CTEM and exposure management is truly that within the environment, this is a problem, or a problem that has one or more vulnerabilities, and we have validated that it is exploitable. So exploitability is a big condition for what would make an exposure. And really, the logic is we're never going to fix every weakness. So we want to start with those that are most severe, and those that we have data to support can truly be leveraged against us today, right?
Yep. Makes sense.
Yeah. So Chris, you said something really interesting there. And I think it sounds like you're a pretty big fan of the CTEM framework. And it's a pretty common, it's a relatively new concept, I would say, at least in its current form. And you sort of hit on it already, but if you could give us just the elevator pitch for why CTEM in particular around managing exposures as opposed to other ways of approaching this, what would that look like?
Sure. Yeah. The pitch I would say is, if you're tired of struggling with find and fix security, then CTEM offers some great new ideas that can help maybe get some new progress. Really, that's where you're spot on, Scott. I kind of have drank the Kool-Aid on CTEM in part because the last decade of my career, I focused on find and fix security. So vulnerability management, application security, some cloud security, and kind of the ways you'd report those things as well. And in my professional life, I've worked with hundreds of organizations, and you always see these headwinds. You always see these blockers. You always see these problems with any of those domains. And some of the ideas behind CTEM are to help try things a different way, where you may not run into those same blockers, to actually be able to tackle the variety of technology we use today between, infrastructure we control, cloud hosted infrastructure, or software experiences like SaaS and platform as a service. And then finally, just honestly, we're not going to exhaust every problem or weakness in our organization. So a better way to take our limited time and resources and prioritize what would be more dangerous to our business or organization. So those are the kind of three things that are why I'm a huge fan of it, and why I'm trying to spread the word. But yeah, in short, if you've ever been frustrated by VM or AppSec or anything like that, you might want to consider CTEM.
So that's interesting, Chris. I know I've heard people talk about CTEM, and I know it's still new, right? But I've heard people talk about it, and they've said that it's complementary, right? Like you can have a vulnerability management program and a CTEM program, but the way you're kind of describing it is really interesting. It almost sounds like an evolution more than something that you're going to kind of run in parallel. Is that?
That was exactly what I was thinking, Steve. It sounded very much where you're talking about how this, in a lot of ways, could be what you view as the future of how vulnerabilities and weaknesses are approached in general. That's what I heard. Is that what you were trying to say?
So yeah, I think that's a great observation. Gartner says that. So they say most major enterprises within the next 5 years will adopt this. They also have a statistic on you're 2/3 less likely to suffer a significant breach if you're using CTEM-like strategies. I look at it as something that unites and directs all of the specific find and fix. So what a lot of organizations call vulnerability management is really infrastructure vulnerability management, finding problems with servers and networking gear and endpoints and things like that. And they might have a separate AppSec program that works on secure design of applications. And then they might even have, yet another for identity, right? Because CTEM also has a wider reach than what we've normally thought of for vulnerability management. So I think in current state, CTEM is a great way to build strategy that helps get all of our unique security disciplines and teams and technologies all supporting the same exposure management purpose. As far as will we get rid of all those component programs today? No, I don't think organizations will do that even anytime in relatively soon, but I think it allows us to get more out of those and to avoid silos and to avoid duplicating efforts sometimes.
Makes sense. So CTEM being relatively new, and for folks that don't know, right, it was, as you mentioned, introduced by Gartner, I think 2 or 3 years ago. Personally, I don't know that I've seen a CTEM, like an operational CTEM program. And if I did, I don't know, maybe I didn't know what I was looking at. They didn't call it that. But I know that you do, because you're working with a lot of organizations to build these programs and implement these programs at GuidePoint. So I guess my question is, what's your approach to getting started, right? To getting a CTEM program off the ground? Kind of where do you start and how do you typically get started?
Yeah, and you're spot on. So we're working with, in my day job, I work a lot with folks that are trying to get CTEM off the ground. And the very first step is scoping. And scoping has a very specific meaning in CTEM. A scope is usually a business function. And so it's actually saying, well, in the old days, we would try to look for vulnerabilities across everything and then figure out where those vulnerabilities belong in our business. Like, what business function maybe do those correspond to? CTEM introduces, you start with a business function, and that's a scope. And then you go looking for the technology and vulnerabilities within that scope. So that process of saying, what are the actual functions of our organization we're trying to secure and trying to define them, that's the very first step. And that's the step that, we've been very busy with ourselves, is just that I call it a paper exercise. You sit down and you say, what's important to this organization? Sometimes you go to peers and compliance or business continuity or something like that. And you say, what are we tracking as these very critical business functions? And then how can we translate that into technology and then translate that into the exposures? So that's the very first step is it, you don't have to buy anything necessarily to get started. You just need to start working through aligning your business functions with what you're trying to do in find and fix security.
Yeah, it almost sounds just kind of like a rethinking, a restructuring of existing vulnerability or exposure management programs, right? A different way to think about it. I mean, if I'm a security leader, a CISO in an organization, is this something I have to go out and hire more people to implement? It sounds like we don't have to spend a lot more money. It's not a lot of new tooling necessarily, but is it more headcount I have to plan on? Like, what kind of resources would I need?
I mean, everyone's situation is different, but it's a great question, Steve, because honestly, for most organizations, no, I wouldn't necessarily have to staff up more because as you mentioned earlier, this is a brand new paradigm. It came out, about 2 years ago. It really gained traction within the last year. So there are no CTEM subject matter experts to go hire, right? Like really, it's a matter of taking a best practice idea and orienting our existing staff towards it. And maybe I need a little consulting. Maybe, I could use another FTE just because of the volume of work, but it's not something where I have to radically change. I like to compare CTEM to zero trust. It's a non-product best practice idea. And when we adopted zero trust, we didn't kick out our network security folks. We just, imbued their operations with zero trust principles, right? Same thing with CTEM.
In an interesting way, Chris, it kind of seems like it's taking threat modeling and making it and sort of bringing it to exposures and vulnerability management processes, right? I mean, this is something that we talk about with our customers all the time. I was just talking to an analyst the other day about this, where to me, it's always felt like a lot of the missing link with how you go from just all of this data that you have to making it actionable is to really apply some sort of framework to it. And it seems like, if you sort of squint and you say, let's start with threat modeling and say what's really important to us first before we even look at the data, that really seems to be the essence of what you're describing here.
Yeah, that's an awesome comparison. I've never actually heard that before, but as you say it, it makes total sense. Then in a threat model, you are looking at the vectors for how you can compromise an application. And typically organizations stack rank applications by their relative criticality to the business. So you do a lot of those same things in CTEM. What are the functions, start with the most important to our business, and what are the ways these can be disrupted or breached? And I'd say the only main difference between threat modeling and CTEM in that regard is in threat modeling, there's a lot of, okay, I know conceptually where this application has weaknesses. Let me shore them up in the creation or design or improvement of that application. Whereas CTEM is, okay, I know this business function, the technology supports it. Let me go find actual problems in them and validate. So not all organizations would validate their threat model by coming in with a pen test immediately, but you would do something more like that in CTEM. But everything else, you're spot on. It's more of a what's the worst thing that can happen, and let's try to close those gaps before we do anything else.
Yeah, it's a really interesting because I haven't thought too much about CTEM over the last couple of years either, right? We've been very focused on more of that vulnerability management. How do we bring product security into it, and how do we have a unified view, right? And so thinking about it from the other direction, where we start with the process and move the other way, there's a lot of things that you're saying here that are really fascinating. But one that you brought up that I think is a really interesting one that I'd like to dig into just a little bit more is around how you determine what the next step is after the scopes, right? So after you create your scopes, what's like the next immediate step that you would take? And then how do you know if you're successful or not when you're starting to develop a CTEM program? Because that seems like with a new paradigm like this, that can be a big challenge to know, are we even doing this right? Like, wait, what is right? So like, how would you normally advise folks on that?
Yeah, that is a really compelling point. So the very first thing I recommend doing once we have established our scope is we need to start the discovery process, because the phase after scoping is discovery. And part of that is to just understand better the variety of technology that's supporting that function. And that may seem trivial, but these days it's definitely not, because our organizations love to go out and get new toys, right? And the example I often give is to pick on human resources, because they like to pick on me. So this is like to, I need to know more. But, and you know who you are out there, but so I like to pick on HR in this example. So if my scope is human resources, which is a function of a business, it may not be revenue generating or anything, but it is. If in the old days, we would go and hit some servers or some endpoints and say, okay, according to Active Directory or according to our CMDB or whatever, these are the HR compute and these are the problems with it. I'm done there as long as I'm meeting my SLAs or whatever. Well, if we're doing CTEM, we sit down and say HR is the scope. We want to, what I like to call prove the positive. We want to kind of reverse engineer how we are supporting that function with technology. And I might sit down with operational folks who have constructed the workflows that HR uses. I might sit down with HR themselves. I'm trying to get a better feel for what is the technology that runs HR. And in a lot of organizations today, they would say like, yeah, we do have 3 servers and 20 endpoints, but 95% of what our work is in Workday SaaS. And it's a SaaS application that's in Workday. And suddenly, if I really want to manage exposure on it, the critical mass of that scope is scrutinizing Workday. And do I have the capabilities to do so? And do I have a way to process problems that I find with those? So that is one of the most critical steps and the most, I would say, differentiated steps from our traditional VM is I have to be more open-minded. I have to look at the variety of technology. And that point might necessitate documenting gaps and just say, we don't have a way to look for problems in Workday today. So the data we're going to give for the time being is not the whole picture of exposure. And that's a segue into, well, what does good look like? You may say, that doesn't look like good. 95% of their workload is in a SaaS application you don't have a way to gauge exposure on. But, hey, good looks like knowing things you don't know and documenting those because that's something thoughtful for the business. And the other thing is good looks like dutifully using the life cycle. CTEM is a 5-stage cycle, and it's a closed loop cycle. And every time we get back to scoping, that's an opportunity to fine tune our operations. And maybe, after going through that cycle for 6 months, we now have an SSPM and we can now actually start to scrutinize Workday. And it goes from a documented gap in exposure to new data that we have to manage exposure on. And that's what good looks like, going through that evolution. You don't have to be intimidated by, a lack of experience doing it. We all have a lack of experience. We're building our experience now. You don't have to be intimidated by even a lack of platform. We can do the best with what we have and acknowledge this is a very iterative process, just like Agile, right? The kind of fail fast and get better thing. We want to do the same thing with CTEM, and the life cycle lets us do that.
So you mentioned the five stages, right? It's scoping, discovery, prioritization, validation, and mobilization. I wrote that down. I didn't memorize it. I know you've got that, Chris, but you mentioned one of the challenges there with, I think of SaaS security posture management, kind of I wouldn't say new field, but there's a lot of organizations out there that are not using those tools yet. To your point, when you start scoping things and looking closely at where the real threats are, they have these gaps. What would you say are, other big challenges and stumbling blocks that you run into during the implementation of a CTEM program?
There are quite a few. One thing I'll touch on is what you just hinted at. Organizations often don't have the breadth of capability in finding exposures to match the breadth of technology they use in their workloads. So SaaS is one that we've been picking on, but this is where Gartner really pushes. Part of why our traditional VM, AppSec, cloud programs didn't fully help shed exposure from our organizations is they were very narrow in their technology purview. So what they're recommending is not just traditional type assets, right? Like servers that we host in our data center or our cloud, but any type of technology resource we use, and not just host-centric, but things like the identity layer. Like what is the posture of identities? As we know, attackers like to move via identity more so than networking these days, in terms of even things like not just SaaS, but leaked data, leaked secrets that we find in the deeper dark web, things like social media impersonation. If I have a business function, what we'd call a scope, that has intellectual property, schematics, whatever, customer data, and that gets dumped on the internet, that's far beyond my realm of control. It's beyond my perimeter, it's beyond my sanctioned apps. But what Gartner's recommending is that gets included into the breadth of exposure information I'm working off of as a CTEM practitioner. So to answer your question, that's the biggest stumbling block, is that so different than the way we've been oriented for years and years that we have to start to be open-minded. And the reality is, when we try to commingle all that data, our technology doesn't like to do that. We have some technology that's CVE-centric, some that's CWE-centric. And so things like if I find dumped data or if I find an identity problem versus a host problem, my methods today of getting that in one place and telling an exposure story, I might feel there's some incongruency between the data. So doing it the right way, I get kind of punished. And we just need to kind of be patient and be creative and work through that together, right?
Absolutely. I think Steve and I can attest to the fact that we see that all the time with what we do in our day jobs. Something that I'm interested in before we move on to the next topic here is you mentioned that there are these stumbling blocks, and there are different ways of thinking about kind of vulnerabilities and exposures. And I would argue that actually some of what you've described is what the RBBM space was really originally built to be, right? And I know it's at this point been dumbed down to a prioritize CVE, button. But when I think about what RBBM was trying to be, I hear a lot of similarities there. And so I was curious, have you seen any organizations in your day job around actually using RBBM in the original approach that much closer mirrors this? Like, have you seen organizations come to this conclusion on their own, or do we really need a fundamental reset with a whole new framework like CTEM to really get this thing off the ground?
So yeah, your earlier question was like, how do you get started, or what are the first steps? And what I always like to say is use what you have, focus on the scopes. Well, focusing on the scopes, what does that mean to us practitioners? It means a metadata tag, right? So if I can get all of my information about vulnerabilities and weaknesses, if I can get that as close to exposures and I can tag them with the scope, then that's where I can start to run a CTEM program. And I may not have all of my leaked data or my identity layer in there, but I've started the process and I can now start to answer what is the relative exposure of business functions. And that right now, one of the most capable platforms to do that is an RBBM, because it will aggregate findings from multiple sources, and I can apply that metadata tag of that label that says this is scope X, this is HR, right? Practically, we have seen organizations come to that conclusion because right now there is no CTEM platform, and CTEM is really it's not a technology space, it's a best practice, kind of like a zero trust. But when it's on us to operationalize it, one of the most effective tools we have today to get started would be an RBBM. And really the opportunity for those to get more in line with the vision would be handling data. You mentioned that they're kind of CVE centric, being able to handle more data that doesn't match up to what traditional findings were, whether that's misconfigurations, whether that's something about your brand, whatever. And then B, how do we do that validation step? Because RBVM's always helped us get data and prioritize it. And right now, I think the industry is exploring where does validation intersect a platform like that. But as far as if you said, Chris, today you have to do this on the show, set up a CTEM program before our eyes, I would probably grab an RBVM to do.
Gotcha. Yeah, which actually really brings me to another question, which is, I mean, how do we as practitioners illustrate the value of CTEM, and how do we know that we're successful? How do we get buy-in, and then how do we show that the project is making progress over time? Because that seems like that's always a challenge with these types of new initiatives.
Yeah, and that's the most important part, right? As security practitioner, our charter is to secure and support the business. So the business or organization, it could be public sector, but so if we're here to secure and support the organization needs to recognize that we're doing so. So we have to be able to communicate that back. And I would say getting the buy-in and then framing up the data has the same through line, which is this business function and scope. And this is why I'm so high on CTEM is because from the start of the life cycle, I grab a business function, so I attribute the technology to it, I go look for the most valid and severe problems in it, and then I tell that back to the business. It's like, oh, product X, which is our most high revenue generating product, we've now attributed relatively all the technology to it. And these are the most likely and exploitable problems that are affecting product X. Whether I communicate that in terms of exposure, or maybe I attribute a risk score that we're going to trend with those stakeholders over time, by framing it up to say it's product X, I've worked in organizations where we had our own version of Product X where it's like, well, if that goes under, we can just turn off the lights and leave. That helps make it more compelling when you have exposure information you're reporting or risk information you're reporting on that. But it also helps get the buy-in from stakeholders. Because again, we may not all understand the nuances of vulnerability. Operational folks, sometimes it's not intuitive to them. But what's intuitive to them is Product X. Like, oh, these are real legit problems with Product X. Well, that's why we're all here. So that can help buy in. Another factor that Gartner calls out is to start with what they call mission critical priorities. So as you start with your business functions, just start with the most important ones. You're going to more likely have that, oh, Product X, well, let me help you out with that from the get-go. And you'll have the most outsized risk reduction. So anything you fix in the Product X scope, sheds the most risk. And then finally, this idea of validation is meant to trim out false positives, because a lot of the folks we want buy-in from say, yeah, we've been down this road for years. This data is junk. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of false positives. So to say, hey, this is attributed to Product X and we've done validation steps, so it should be unlikely you're seeing false positives. We've kind of done all that for you. It's a good way to try to reboot and get everyone on the same page.
So you mentioned risk score, and
he said the magic words, didn't he, Steve? He said risk score. I immediately, my ears perked up.
Yeah. So we obviously look at a lot of metrics, with Nucleus for our customers, like scanning coverage, like time to remediate, risk score, vulnerability recurrence, things like this. And when we look at those metrics, we look at them over time, kind of trend them out. We'll compare them to benchmarks and industry and stuff like that to try to show like, here's success, here's progress, things like that. So I'm just kind of curious how CTEM compares to kind of more traditional RBBM in this regard, and what are the metrics that you monitor that you believe are most reflective of a successful CTEM program? Are they different than VM? I mean, you mentioned one thing, which was using validation to kind of, filter out the noise, right? I mean, I feel like that could probably be a really good metric, because I know a lot of people spend a lot of time on remediation of things that really that are not high risk. They might have been scored by a tool as high risk, but you do this validation, you bring in context and it's not. So are there any metrics like that you're focused on that are different than RBBM that to kind of measure success?
So what's good and bad about where we're at right now with CTEM is there aren't a list of like your standard bread and butter metrics. Like for better or worse, we kind of had those in VM. And the example of risk scoring I find interesting because leadership tends to understand it or even expect it. So like the board or the C-suite, even folks that maybe aren't technologists, they understand out of 1,000 and 850 is bad, right? And how is that up or down? Like, so that's why it's sort of gained a lot of traction. Is it exactly the best CTEM metric? We could have an argument about that because there's no winner as far as the best CTEM metrics. You brought up a great point with the validation. We talked earlier about how we roll multiple weaknesses into a parent problem, and then once that's validated as exploitable, that becomes the exposure. And fixing one exposure could fix 100 vulnerabilities or misconfigurations. So the fact that what's different about CTEM is that we're collating in a smarter way all these problems. One thing we could get back to that for years folks like me have said is a bad way to do it is something that might be more count-based. So I've always been against the count of vulnerabilities because we have no control over that for many reasons. Microsoft could have 1,000 disclosures on Patch Tuesday, and now we have thousands and thousands of vulnerabilities. It looks like we did something wrong, right? But when you are collating in this way of, okay, these are one parent problem, like missing that Patch Tuesday patch, right? That's superseded as one problem, then you're insulated from disclosures or things in your business causing your count to shoot up and down. So you could actually start to say, if we have a criteria stated in our standard of what makes an exposure the worst exposure, or, that top tier of exposure, you could start to count those again and say in the Product X scope, we had 25 of our critical exposures, which were these parent problems that have been validated and are correlated, and now we're down to 20. Like you could start to think of metrics because you've done a more thoughtful job of putting the data together, that you could reintroduce some metrics that had fallen by the wayside But a risk score is perfectly fine because it hits those stakeholders right where they need to be, right?
Makes a lot of sense. I guess when I think about normal vulnerability management and risk-based vulnerability management, large enterprises, we're often dealing with millions of vulnerabilities. And to your point, counting them is just silly in terms of a measurement of success because it is kind of out of your control. But I guess in CTEM, by grouping things this way, I mean, we're probably talking about like tens, like you mentioned the number 25. Is that kind of real number? Like, are we talking about, somewhere between 10, 20, 30, up to 100 of these exposures that are these parent problems? Because if the numbers are that small, I think absolutely it can make a lot more sense to grade things by the count.
Depending on the scope and depending on the environment, it's totally a possible number. For anyone at home who's used a CNAPP, a Cloud Native Application Protection Platform, a lot of them will find thousands of problems with your cloud environments, but they will distill them into toxic combinations where they match misconfigurations with vulnerabilities or application flaws. If you just click between the tabs of, well, show me all my vulnerabilities, now show me all of my combined problems, you would notice a huge drop off in the volume. And by doing CTEM, you'd have even more reduction in the number once you've introduced that criteria for, but what makes an exposure are critical, and that's again, something you can start to determine without buying anything. While you're doing your scoping, you can start to come up with these criteria for what qualifies an exposure as the worst. Once you basically correlate these to parent problems and you apply your filter for this is what makes it a critical, you could have a reduction from millions to thousands or less. It's not impossible.
Right. Very cool.
So just to kind of summarize real quick, I want to make sure that, we're parroting back will be the part of the listener here. Sorry for everybody who went super blurry. That's because it knew that I've got the face for radio. So what I'm basically hearing, right, if we're going to just break this down to here's how this actually would function, right? You've got your kind of just raw data, vulnerabilities, findings, whatever you want to call them. And then you basically identify, those, you mentioned criticals, right? So what does critical mean to us? So there's like a layer of prioritization within the massive amount of data that needs to happen. And then that will maybe go from, call it 1 million down to 10,000 or whatever, right? 10,000 things that you really care about based on some criteria you set. And then you're doing grouping. So you're doing prioritization. You're sort of filtering a bunch of stuff out. Then you're going to group it into these exposures or actually into these scopes. And then you're going to group again into basically exposures within scopes. That's kind of what I'm hearing you to discuss, but
I heard it slightly differently. I heard it as starting with exposures. First you do starting with the scopes, then you do everything you described within the context of each scope. But I don't know. Tell us who's right, Chris.
Well, you're both right. So you do start with the scope, and then
that's the answer, Chris. It's the best answer.
I know. That's why I'm still on the show and I haven't been kicked off. You start with the scope, and then you find the technology, and you find all the weaknesses. Now, from there, through where we finally hand off the fixable problem to our what we used to call remediation owners, Gartner is now kind of calling them mobilization partners because it's now mobilization. Everything between where we've discovered the tech and the weaknesses within our scope to where we hand off the fixable problem, I say you have some creative control over, because there's multiple pathways where you could get to a perfectly fine CTEM outcome. You don't have to do it by the book. According to the book, you would either put together those weaknesses into parent problems, then prioritize those parent problems, or as Scott described, you prioritize every problem, then you lump together the and probably take a highest common denominator. So if any of them matched your critical, that whole parent problem is a critical. And then, so either way, whether you want to assign priorities to weaknesses first and then collate them, or if you want to collate them first and give them the priority, that's up to you. And that's up to your processes and your technology and this and that. And then after that, you would say, but which of these that we think has these severities would we check to see is actually exploitable, is valid, the validation, and then we filter out what's not. However, that's why I say anything from discovery through mobilization, you have creative control. You could validate first. You could take all the weaknesses, and if you had a capability to validate them at scale, you could discard what wasn't proven to be exploitable then prioritize and collate, and then hand off. That's perfectly viable. If you had me design CTEM, I would, like, on paper and not think of the real world, I would probably say that, because most organizations I've worked with and met say, we want to prioritize things that are exploitable here. And if we have a mitigating or compensating control, or there's something architecturally why it's not, we want to, well, there's no better way than to validate first, and then either rank down or discard what can't be exploited based on your testing, and then prioritize what's left. Or you could do it the way Gartner describes, prioritize things that are theoretical and validate at the end and discard that.
Like your way better. I think we should talk to Gartner and have them update their process.
If you're not returning my...
If you're listening, Chris here looking for sponsorships also. We can Michael Jordan, Nike, this thing.
We're coming up on time here. I did have one more question. Speaking of Gartner, I was skimming through their 2024 hype cycle for security operations, where they talk a lot about CTEM, right? And they basically, in that document, in that report, they created this, what I believe is a new category of tools called exposure assessment platforms, or EAPs. And I've got a note here written down. They, quote, aim to consolidate vulnerability assessment and vulnerability prioritization technologies all into one platform, unquote. So I guess the question is, do you have any thoughts on this category? I hear that they're coming out with a magic quadrant at the beginning, in early 2025, Q1. Any thoughts on, like, this category and particularly how it relates to CTEM?
Yeah, I mean, I thanks for the heads up about that magic quadrant. I'll start by drinking in preparation now so that I'm ready for it. So I know what you're talking about. Basically, they're pushing together their previous spaces, they being Gartner. Gartner's pushing together their previous spaces for vulnerability assessment and vulnerability prioritization, because there are a lot of technologies that are now both finding problems and being this prioritization layer we've talked so much about. But I like to think of security not in product spaces or magic quadrants, but in functional outcomes. And that's why I love CTEM, because the whole point of CTEM is to say, okay, how can we just figure out the worst things in our organization's technology that make us the most susceptible as an organization? That's an outcome I can align to, figuring out what's bad and valid, and working with the business, all playing out of the same textbook. Like, that's not a product thing. That's a paradigm. When you get into the magic quadrant, it's a product thing. And at the end of the day, I like to decouple finding problems versus prioritizing them. And there's a value to having something that's dedicated to prioritize and letting the vulnerability assessment tools come and go. There's simply no vendor on earth that can do everything we've talked about in this episode well. That's a great cloud and AppSec and infrastructure and identity and brand protection and SaaS company all in one. There may be companies that have a lot of those capabilities, but not everything, or they're not great at everything. So this idea that, well, where you prioritize and where you triage, and that kind of plane where you run your program in the day-to-day, should also be the thing finding the problems. I think there's value in it being separate, because then you're not forced into using subpar vulnerability identification tools. You can do it as you see fit, or maybe there's a few things that reporting tool does find that you like, and you want to use 3 other vendors for the rest. So I'm not like a huge fan of that. I think it's a response to changes technologies have made, and I like to think and orient a security program on capabilities, and finding problems and reporting problems are still distinct capabilities in the real world.
I love that answer. It's fantastic and very practical answer. Awesome. Cool. Well, guys, this has been a great conversation, but we are out of time here. So, Chris, just to wrap up, do you have any final thoughts, any final insights that you'd like to leave us with on the topic of CTEM?
I would just say that everyone is a candidate for CTEM. It doesn't matter if you are in a large or small organization, that you have a lot or a few tools. The principles we're talking about today, you can get started. A lot of folks just feel like I'm just not a good candidate for it, and everyone is. And on our own level, we can start to introduce some better exposure management everywhere. And I'd like to just encourage folks to give it a shot. And as a security community, we're figuring it out together. So
Awesome. Well, thank you. And that's it for today's episode of Big thanks to Chris Peltz for joining us today. It's been a lot of fun, Chris. And thank you all for tuning in. Take care.
Thanks for having me.
All right.
See you next time.